Well, we might get started. Well, good evening and welcome everybody. It's great to see you all here. I'm Peter Gahan. I'm the Associate Dean Teaching and Learning here in the Faculty of Business and Economics. And to start, I'd first like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nations, the traditional owners of the unceded land on which tonight's lecture is taking place, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I suppose it's also timely, given the recent referendum, to acknowledge, I suppose, that outcome and I suppose the difficulty that many of us may experience in accepting that as the will of the people. If you haven't read the Uluru Statement from the Heart, I would encourage you to do so. It's a short document, just 2 pages. You could Google it now if you wish, and it's an extraordinary document, I think, in many respects, that offers in a very generous way to provide a path towards reconciliation. And I suppose I hope that in light of the result, that this does not sort of expire those ambitions to walk together towards reconciliation. In making that acknowledgement, I would also like to acknowledge the importance of Indigenous knowledge in the Academy as a community of researchers, teachers, professional staff and students. We're privileged to work and learn every day with our Indigenous colleagues and partners. And I extend my respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us here tonight. So it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to the 2023 Foenander Lecture and to welcome, I suppose, many familiar faces as well as new ones to this lecture. So commencing in 1986, the Foenander Lecture was established in memory of Orwell D. Foenander, who was an academic here at the University of Melbourne and one of the leading figures in industrial relations scholarship in the early 20th century. So tonight marks the 36th Foenander Lecture with a gap in 2020 due to COVID. Each year we invite a distinguished figure from government, business, the union movement or academia to present a lecture on contemporary issues in industrial relations and human resource management. As the lecture is named in honour of Orwell de Ruyter Foenander, it is appropriate to give a brief background on his career. So he was born in 1890, an auspicious year for industrial relations in Australia, and in 1909 he began a law course here at the University of Melbourne. He joined the newly established Faculty of Economics and Commerce in 1926 as a part-time lecturer, and then by 1954 was appointed the head of the newly formed Department of Industrial Relations. He was the first head of an industrial relations department at an Australian university. He retired from full-time teaching in 1957, but continued on a part-time basis until his retirement in 1969. His research focused on the federal system of conciliation and arbitration, with a primary focus on the economic and protective functions of the federal tribunal. He was interested in the role of industrial tribunals to deal with social problems and the role of unions as agents of change. So Orwell passed away in 1985, and we commenced this lecture series in a year later, funded by a trust set up by the family. The faculty is pleased to continue honouring Orwell Foenander and his achievements through this lecture series. So industrial relations continues to be a hot topic internationally and in Australian politics and industry, which highlights the continued relevance of our Foenander Lecture series. And it's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker this evening, Peter Turnbull. So Peter is a Professor of Industrial Relations at the University of Bristol and President of the British Universities Industrial Relations Association Bureau. He previously held posts at the Universities of Cardiff, it's a long list here, Peter, Leeds, Warwick, the London School of Economics, and held visiting professorships and fellowships at Queen's University in Belfast, Cornell, the University of Melbourne, where we first met in 1992 or 94, La Trobe, Monash, RMIT, and the ILO in Geneva. So Peter is a graduate of the University of Leeds, where he did a BA in economics, Warwick University, where he did a Master's in Industrial Relations, and Cardiff, where he completed his PhD in Conflict on the Waterfront. He's an academic fellow, Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development, and a member of the Advisory, Conciliation and Arbitration Service, or ACAS, on their arbitration panel. His research focuses on the European transport sector, specifically around civil aviation, maritime and ports, inland waterways and road transport, and the impact of transport deregulation on employment, industrial relations and HRM. So Peter works with national and international organisations to promote social dialogue and is currently facilitating negotiations at the UK's National Air Traffic Services. And he was invited to present policy options to curtail bogus self-employment in aviation and cruise of convenience in shipping at a recent meeting of the European Council of Transport Ministers. So we're delighted to have Peter, to hear from Peter tonight, one of Britain's foremost industrial relations experts on the topic of IR policymaking in the age of neoliberalism. So Peter will give his presentation and there'll be an opportunity then for you to ask questions. So Peter, can we please welcome Peter to the rostrum to commence his lecture. Thank you, Peter.
Thanks very much. Let's get this up. So the title of the lecture today is basically refers to policymakers' seeming aversion at the moment to articulate a kind of a big vision for a different kind of society in general and industrial relations policy in particular. And I'm also interested in whether industrial relations academic can have any kind of traction at the moment in an age of neoliberalism. In the UK at the moment, we're heading towards a general election, very slowly, it seems. But it seems that the Labour Party in particular are trying to avoid saying anything that those on the right in the UK could use to create some kind of wedge issue between the parties. You may have noticed that I've added the word moving to the title. The Labour Party conference recently, this was heard by a number of delegates there. They said, well, it's not just about a small target, it's a small moving target. And based on the kind of research that I've done over the years, working to try to develop more progressive industrial relations policies, I've come to the conclusion that there's two kind of broad but very important areas that we need to consider if industrial relations academics are going to have any impact on policy making. So the first of these relates to different types of policy ideas. So we can think about new policy ideas that we might apply to specific situations. These are often quite easy to develop. You know, we might develop a new policy to address a particular problem. We can apply traditional standards, norms, values to these. And we normally layer these on top of existing policies. So we've recently had a new piece of legislation in the UK around strikes in essential services. And that's clearly just been layered on top of a whole body of trade union legislation which has tried to regulate strikes. This bit of legislation is in response to a number of disputes that we've had in the public sector recently. Policy programmes go much deeper in terms of trying to identify a problem and use particular analytical frameworks. So we try to understand more about the root cause of a problem and therefore, you know, the kind of resolve some of the problems around the state that we're in. So you can think about, from the 1980s in the UK, we've had a progressive programme of trade union and employment reform in the UK, which reflects a particular view of people about the role of trade unions in society, the regulation of industrial conflict. If you then think about philosophical ideas, these are much more difficult to change or to embed within society. These kind of ideas are fundamental to our understanding of, you know, the way in which people see themselves and the world around them. So, for example, we might think about the idea that markets are the most efficient way of governing social relationships, the idea that you know, open markets, competition will drive investment, that growth, if we can encourage growth in the economy, then wealth will trickle down through society and everybody will be better off. Now that's obviously a kind of a neoliberal interpretation of, you know, a kind of a general philosophy to how we might organise social relationships. My perception is that the current problems that we have lie not so much in developing new policy ideas or programs or philosophies. The problem is trying to escape from the old ones. That some of these ideas have become so embedded within society that it's getting quite difficult to move away from those. So if you think about a different way of thinking about society, there's a quote from the former General Secretary of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, who said that the spread of markets has outpaced the abilities of societies and political systems to adjust to them, let alone control the course that they take. And history teaches us that this imbalance between the economic, the social, and the political realms can never be sustained for very long. And that seems to kind of capture the kind of state that we're in, that the way in which we've encouraged markets and market relationships has outpaced our ability to control these markets and some of the adverse effects that they have on people. An alternative kind of philosophy or a way of thinking about this is the argument that economies can only perform well to the extent that they're embedded in a well-integrated society. And to have a well-integrated society, we have to have some kind of normative constraints or social obligations against the pursuit of individual self-interest. So there's different, if you like, different philosophical ideas about the way in which we organise society. The problem that we have in the UK is that this is a quote from Milton Friedman, who said that it's only a crisis that produces real change. And when change occurs, the actions depend on the ideas that are lying around. And it seems that the ideas that are lying around are these kind of tired and failed ideas of neoliberalism. This is one of our recent prime ministers. We've had quite a few recently. Liz Truss lasted 45 days in office. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, Kwasi Kwarteng, lasted 39 days, but this was long enough for them to crash the UK economy. They announced £45 billion of unfunded spending cuts. There was a run on sterling. It went to its lowest level against the US dollar. And the Bank of England had to buy, or promised to buy, £65 billion of government bonds in order to prevent the economy going completely out of control. I've put words into Liz Truss's mouth here. Those are not her words. Those are the words of Milton Friedman. I'm in favour of cutting taxes under any circumstances, for any excuse, for any reason, whenever it's possible. The words coming out of Kwasi Kwarteng's mouth are his own. I think we might have got a bit carried away. To which we might say, oh, no shit, Sherlock. Did you not think? Now, the key problem here is the extent to which neoliberals have control over ideas. Having control over ideas means that you have the capacity, or some social actors have the capacity to dominate the meaning of ideas. And they also have the ability to compel other actors to uphold those ideas, even though they don't necessarily believe in them. So at the moment, the Labour Party in the UK will not say anything about any policy initiatives unless they can show that they are funded in some way. So they're unwilling to make any commitments unless they can demonstrate that these are can be funded in some way. Now, I think John Maynard Keynes would have a view about that, a very different view about the role of government and government spending. But because of the way in which these ideas are embedded and their control over ideas, the question is, how do we actually go about changing that? And it's only if you think about this instead of control over ideas, if we think about how you influence these things through ideas, by reasoning, persuasion, our ability to convince others of the cognitive validity or normative value of our ideas, that's the only way we're going to try to change the control that these people have over ideas within society. So that's the first thing, this getting a handle on different types of ideas and the way that influences policy or people's perception of what would be a big vision, a different view about society. The second dimension is drawn from the theories of discursive institutionalism. And this is the difference between the coordinative discourse of policy construction and the communicative discourse of political communication. So when we think about ideas, it's not just the kind of substantive content of ideas, if you like, the cognitive arguments about the necessity of particular approaches or normative arguments about the appropriateness of particular ideas. It's also about the interactive processes that are taking place and the institutional context in which ideas are being discussed. So in some economies like the UK, we have a relatively simple polity. We have a two-party system, first past the post voting system. So your objective is basically to get a big majority in a general election, get yourself elected, and then you can basically do whatever you want. I mean, that's a very simple interpretation, but I'll demonstrate this in a moment. What is then much more problematic is the communicative discourse, because you then got to convince people that what you're doing is appropriate or will fix the problem. And the problem, of course, is that prior to doing that, you're not articulating any big vision. It's these kind of small moving targets that you're talking about. So you're arguing about percentages, not principles or philosophies or about the nature of societies. It's about these small things. And we can illustrate this with another of our prime ministers. This one lasted 3 years rather than 3 weeks. Theresa May was finding it difficult to get Brexit done, in the words of her successor, Boris Johnson. So in 2017, she announced a snap election. What has come to light subsequently is that the decision to take this snap election was made by her two aides, the two people standing either side of her. This is Fiona Hill and Nick Timothy. They basically decided that it would be a good idea to hold a snap election, get a bigger majority, and then they would be able to push through an agreement with the European Union for Brexit. They also wrote the manifesto. And then went to Theresa May and said, we think it's a good idea to have a snap election, and here's a manifesto. Theresa May read it, thought it was pretty good. She added some of her own priorities around social care and announced a snap election. There's a great documentary recently by Laura Kunsberg, the BBC's political editor, talking to some of the people behind these events. They all got on the Conservative government or the cabinet ministers got on a big blue bus to go up to Halifax in the north of England to announce the election and present the Conservative manifesto. All the other cabinet ministers had not actually seen the manifesto. So they're going to announce the manifesto, and they were basically told to sit on the front row and just smile and nod. And Theresa May, if you can watch the film, she said, today I launch my manifesto, not the manifesto of the government or the Conservative Party. Today I launch my manifesto for a stronger, fairer and more prosperous Britain. She'd added something on on social care, social policy, which the press dubbed a dementia tax. It was this idea that old people would have to pay more for their care in old age. The communicative discourse got into a real mess. They had real problems communicating this, convincing people that this was a way that you could fix social care. So we have this relatively simple coordinative discourse where you can, very few people can come together, write a manifesto basically, but then you have a real problem then communicating that to people and getting them to kind of sign up. Now, if you're having doubts about the problems of politicians with the communicative discourse, I'm going to play you a little film. You'll see the bottom right-hand corner there. This is what's happening to strikes in the UK. So this is going back all the way to 1931, and you can see where we are on the right-hand column. Okay. So obviously this is a bit of an issue. Over the last year, we've lost over 4 million working days. The last time this happened was in the late 1980s. So as an industrial relations academic, it feels like we're back in business. So if you can hopefully this will work, but just play the film.
These strikes are wrong at a time when negotiations are still going on. But parents and the public have been let down by both sides because the government has acted in a reckless and provocative manner. After today's disruption, I urge both sides to put aside the rhetoric, get round the negotiating table and stop it happening again.
I listened to your speech in Wrexham and you talked about the Labour Party being a movement. A lot of people in that movement are the people who are on strike today, and they'll be looking at you and thinking, well, you're describing these strikes as wrong. Why aren't you giving us more leadership as a leader of the Labour movement?
At a time when negotiations are still going on, I do believe these strikes are wrong. And that's why I say both sides should, after today's disruption, get round the negotiating table, put aside the rhetoric and sort the problem out. because the public and parents have been let down by both sides. The government's acted in a reckless and provocative manner.
I spoke to Francis Moore before I came here, and the tone he was striking was a very conciliatory one. Do you think there's a difference between the words they're saying in public and the attitude they're striking in private in these negotiations? Are there negotiations in good faith, would you say?
What I say is that the strikes are wrong when negotiations are still going on, but the government has acted in a reckless and provocative manner in the way it's gone about these issues. After today's disruption, I urge both sides to get around the negotiating table, put aside the rhetoric, and stop this kind of thing happening again.
It's a statement you've made publicly, and you'll make to me, and this will be broadcast, obviously, but have you spoken privately to any union leaders and expressed your view to them on a personal level, would you say?
Well, what I say in public and in private to everybody involved in this is get round the negotiating table, put aside the rhetoric, and stop this kind of action happening again. These strikes are wrong because negotiations are still going on, but parents and the public have been let down by the government as well, who've acted in a reckless and provocative manner.
You're a parent, I'm a parent, a lot of people watching this will be parents. Has it affected you personally, this action? Has it affected your family, your friends? I mean, and what is the net effect of that going to be on parents having to take a day off work today?
I think parents up and down the country have been affected by this action, and it's wrong at a time when negotiations are still going on. Parents have been let down by both sides because the government has acted in a reckless and provocative manner. I think that both sides should, after today's disruption, get around the negotiating table, put aside the rhetoric, and stop this kind of thing happening again.
Ed Miliband was leader of the Labour Party from 2010 to 2015. He's currently Shadow Secretary of State for Energy and Security, Energy Security and Net Zero. This particular photo here was taken of Ed eating a bacon sandwich, and it appeared on the front page of The Sun and lots of other papers. Now, I mean, clearly, it's understandable that politicians, Labour Party politicians in particular, are very cautious about saying things. You know, the Murdoch press putting these kind of images on the front page of their newspapers. But there's clearly a problem here with the communicative discourse, or what we might refer to as the politics of signification. So power relationships in any given policy context are manifest in these cognitive and normative frames that legitimize particular groups rather than others. So some actors or some relationships are castigated as the problem, trade unions or collective bargaining. Others are seen to be part of the solution, and that typically means employers, markets, competitions. As IR academics, we're clearly capable of coming up with policy ideas in response to particular problems, and we can even present something that looks more like a coherent programme of reform. So this is the manifesto for labour law, produced by the Institute of Employment Rights. This was the work of a number of practising and academic labour lawyers and industrial relations scholars, many of these from the University of Bristol, myself included. This was formally adopted by the Labour Party for the 2017 general election. But if you look at some of the ideas that we came up with in the bottom right-hand corner here about the Ministry of Labour, restoring sectoral collective bargaining, strengthening trade union rights, in particular the right to strike, etc., we clearly would have had a problem with the communicative discourse, convincing people, as employers in particular, that this was a good idea. Sectoral collective bargaining, when employers no longer operate through employers' associations, for example, when we decentralise collective bargaining. The idea of giving people employment rights from day one, we can make an argument for this, we can make a normative argument to justify this, we can show evidence from other countries that it works, but actually doing that is actually going to be really difficult. Theresa May won the election in 2017 with a greatly reduced majority. Labour were up 30 seats, the Conservatives were down by 13. And what we got instead was this. We got the Taylor Review of Modern Working Practices. Now, for me, this is the kind of nadir of industrial relations policy making in the UK. Who decided that the Royal Society of Arts was the best organisation to do a big review of the future of work and what represents good work? If you read this report, it largely overlooks academic industrial relations research. It talks about good work rather than decent work, for example, which we link to international labour standards, for example. It talks about the British way, which of course is consistent with Brexit, this idea that we've got a particular way of managing labour markets. And the entire report is infused with language of choice, individual voice, etc. There's very little around collective voice in this particular report. Now, perhaps we shouldn't be that surprised about this aversion to evidence-based policy making and academic research. The year before the publication of this report, during the Brexit campaign, the then Chancellor, Michael Gove, declared that the people of this country have had enough of experts. We don't want to take advice from experts. He actually later clarified that he was actually talking about economists who consistently get things wrong. You're probably aware that economists tend to be much more confident about their policy advice compared to industrial relations academics. They claim to have established all these kind of universal laws around supply and demand, prices and incomes, interest rates and investment, wage determination and employment, and much more besides. I always tell my students there's only 2 general laws of economics that you need to understand. Peter's heard this before. The first law is that for every economist, there's an equal and opposite economist. And the second law is that invariably they're both wrong. In industrial relations, I'm only aware of one universal law, if we can call it that, which is attributed to the work of John Commons. Now, unlike Karl Marx, who talks about struggle at the point of production, Commons highlighted the struggle over the extension of market relationships, and in particular attempts to ward off what he called the menace of competition. So the law, if we can call it that, is the idea that union organisation and action tends to follow the contours of the market. It's actually based on the shoemakers' unions in America, and he showed that as the kind of market extended to become national, that the unions kind of followed the market to try to regulate wages and conditions within that particular market. But what Commons also talks about is the protective organisations of employers, because he said it was just as important for employers to set up protection against inferior goods as it was for unions to set up organisations to protect against low wages. So he says that the producers resort either to private organisations equipped with coercive weapons to suppress their menacing competitor, or else they seek to persuade or compel the government to suppress him. So in this way, the contest of classes or interests enters the field of politics, and the laws of the land and even the very framework of government are the outcome of a struggle both to extend markets and to ward off their menace. As industrial relations academics, we obviously work with both employers and trade unions to kind of project the policy ideas that we might have, the kind of policy programs with government, to try to change the way in which we think about the function or the constitution of institutions, the way they work, the laws of the land. In the 1960s in the UK, this was from a paper by Bill McCarthy, who was a prominent member of the Oxford School, who was also appointed research director of a Royal Commission that looked at trade unions and employers' associations. So this was the kind of exact opposite of the Taylor Report, where you had academic researchers writing these very detailed research reports on employment law, the role of shop stewards, wage negotiations, etc. And McCarthy, in this paper in the British Journal of Industrial Relations, reflected on the fact that half the members of the British Universities Industrial Relations Association were working for the Royal Commission, and the other half were working for the National Board for Prices and Incomes. As the current president of Bureau, I can confirm that hardly any of our members are working for the current government. So I would concur with the conclusion of McCarthy when he says that when corporatism is out of fashion, legalism is advancing, collectivism remains at a discount, there's going to be no revival in the demand for the services of industrial relations academics. Now, having said that, industrial relations academics in the UK are actually very active in trying to influence policy. I'm sure everybody had this kind of thing. What do you do during COVID when you're locked down? You sat at home, you can't go anywhere. So what we did, we interviewed 47 industrial relations academics in the UK who we know are very active in kind of trying to influence policy. So these are academics who are trying to do the right thing. They're not ivory tower academics. They're people who are kind of trying to engage with policymakers. They're getting their hands dirty in the factories, the dark satanic mills, or the flag of convenience vessels that we might talk about today. They're trying to engage in participatory forms of research with different social actors, typically with the purpose of, or for the purpose of emancipation. They try to imagine how the world of work might be different, so they're not just writing about what's wrong, they're trying to work for what they see is right. This might be, these are the kind of things that people are doing. They're looking at pension reforms, equality and diversity in the workplace, support for disabled workers, health and safety, better protection for workers, gig workers, lots more kind of areas of policy besides. I particularly like this image because it gives you an idea of the relative power of capital and labour. You know, these are a few people in a very small boat trying to stop the departure of a flag of convenience vessel from a port in Australia. Most of my own involvement with policy making comes through the work of trade unions with the problem group, as far as the neoliberals would see this. And we've developed an approach to this idea of how do you help unions represent the interests of their members more effectively. So we've seen this big increase in strike, the argument of force, but what about the force of argument? How do we actually go about helping unions to gather better evidence to represent the interests of their members? So we see there are kind of four components of this. So we can think about the social science evidence, our knowledge for understanding. There's then sector-specific knowledge, you know, what goes on in particular industries or amongst particular occupations, the knowledge for action in that particular sector. There's then the insight of activists and officials, the knowledge for framing. How do we frame these things in a way that helps members understand that, you know, that they have a legitimate claim to make? So if you think about public sector workers, you know, if you're putting people's lives at risk by going on strike, how do you legitimise that? How do you frame that in a way that will, you know, that will convince members that this is an appropriate course of action? And then there are all the perspectives of the different stakeholders here. So these are obviously employers, obviously trade unions, government, NGOs, community groups, there's consumers. So there's all these kind of groups of people. So if we take something like the social science evidence, for example, we know that long working hours has detrimental effects on people's health. But how does that play out in a particular sector where, you know, we've done work, for example, with police officers who are working excessive hours, airline pilots, bus drivers, truck drivers. So because of people's different shift systems, the kind of work that they're doing, that will actually play out in different ways in different sectors. Now, the knowledge for legitimacy, the different stakeholders, is really important if we think about different types of policies. Different types of economies, or I'm going to talk about the European Union, where you have a more complex polity. So where there are different interest groups and there's a different way of coming about or reaching policy decisions. So a lot of the work that I do and still do despite Brexit is around EU policy making. And the simple way of kind of trying to explain this is that we have a council of ministers, you know, member states send the relevant ministers, whether it's ministers for transport, communications, energy. So here the member states are the kind of key players. So you can think about this group as like the government. We then have the civil service, the European Commission. These are people who are kind of bureaucrats who will read reports, for example, one of the things with them. And then we have the European Parliament, where these are elected representatives from all the different member states that have what we call co-decision making policies. In the Council of Ministers, the way in which this works is that some countries will raise policy issues at a European level because they can't get reform in their own country, so they want to be able to download EU policies because there may be social groups, unions that are blocking change. There are other member states that want to upload their policies to bring everybody up to their level. So member states play different roles. And what's important is that when you have the presidency of the EU, it rotates on a 6-month basis, you can set the agenda. So last year we had a meeting of the European transport ministers. France had the presidency of the EU. So these are all the transport ministers from Europe. I'm sat at the back under the middle aeroplane. I'm the person not wearing a mask. This was just after COVID. So you get 10 minutes to talk to all the European transport ministers about some of the problems of transport regulation and the way in which markets are organised and the impact that that has on transport workers' terms and conditions, about the way in which this is driving, what I was trying to argue was driving a race to the bottom. So we've got the Council of Ministers, we've got the European Commission, which in a sense, is like the civil service. It's implementing the initiatives of the Council of Ministers, and we've got the Parliament that has co-decision making. So the legislation that comes from, when things are drafted by the European Commission go to both the Council and the European Parliament to vote on. We now call this the ordinary legislative process. The important thing about the Commission is that although it's seen as a kind of this is kind of like a civil service, it also has certain powers which gives it the scope to act in a particular way. It's the guardian of the treaty of the European Union, and it also administers EU competition law. So if the Commission, if you bring to the attention of the Commission an organisation or a practice that seems to be violating EU competition law, the European Commission can take action, infringement procedures against that company. So if you've got a national airline, for example, and the government is paying money into that airline, that could be viewed as state aid and against EU competition law. So the Commission, in terms of its strategies, can either target member states where they know that they're not complying with the rules, and then other member states who are not quite so sure whether they're breaking the rules. It's a kind of what we call a divide and conquer strategy. Or they get asked by the European Council of Ministers to maybe develop some policy on something. And what they do is they then produce something which is a real kind of market liberalising, kind of open process. And they say to the member states, well, if you don't like that, come up with a lesser evil. So they have these kind of strategies where they can force through change. The other strategy that they have, which is less kind of researched or talked about, is rhetorical framing. So they often kind of will put out statements about something which is trying to frame the debate in a particular way. Now, this is really important because if you think about decision making and policy, we can think about this kind of outer circle as the liberal master frame, the way in which people talk about markets as being, open competition, fair competition, the idea that this will drive innovation and efficiency. And we have a particular way of talking about that in the European Union around the four freedoms, the free movement of capital, labour, goods and services. So there's a particular way of talking about the European project and the whole drive towards open markets, competition, etc. The middle ring, the discourse practice, this is about where we set the agenda. So who has the ability to set the agenda? Who has the power to determine over which there's going to be a contest, some kind of vote on a particular policy? And then the outcome is a particular text, a particular EU policy. So let me give you an example of this. Ryanair, I'm going to talk about Ryanair, is an Irish airline registered in Ireland. It has 80 bases around Europe. So Ryanair might hire a pilot from Bulgaria. That pilot might work from an airport in Germany and every day fly to Spain or Italy. Never goes to Ireland, but under the regulations, the place where they work is where they pay their social taxes, their social payments. So that's for your water rates, your sewage, library services, whatever, waste collection. The place where you work is the aircraft. That aircraft is registered in Ireland, therefore it's Irish territory. So you had somebody a Bulgarian working in Germany, flying to Spain and Italy every day, never setting foot in Ireland, but paying taxes to Ireland. So we had to change the wording to the place where you work or where you work from. I work from Germany, therefore I pay my social taxes in Germany. The way in which we did this was we lobbied through members of Parliament, members of the European Parliament, because they have people in their local constituency who are paying taxes in Ireland when they're living in their constituency. So you can mobilise that group to present this as a policy to the European Union. When it came to the vote in the Council, every member state voted in favour except one that abstained. I don't know if you want to guess which country abstained. Ireland, correct, well done. This brings me back to John Commons and the menace of competition. Who are the menaces? So in this complex policy, who are the menaces? Who are the people who are driving competition in a particular way? So Commons talks about the marginal producers, those whose competition is dragging everybody else down to the lowest level. Do we know who these characters are? The cartoon characters? Dennis the Menace. Which one do you recognise? The one on the right or the one on the left? Yeah, they're both Dennis the Menaces. They both appeared first in cartoons in 1951. The one on the left is Dennis Mitchell, the American Dennis the Menace, who's quite an angelic little kid who just gets in trouble kind of by mistake, really. He has all these plans and they end up in catastrophe and stuff. And his neighbour, Mr. Wilson, is often the kind of, the butt of all these problems. Dennis the Menace, the British one, he doesn't have a surname. He purposefully causes trouble. He's the kid with the Sid Vicious haircut, wearing the Kurt Cobain hoop jumper. If you get those references, you're obviously of my generation and not a younger generation. If we stick with the musical theme, you could think of the American Dennis the Menace as the Monkees, and the UK Dennis the Menace as the Sex Pistols. That would be the comparison. Now think about modern day platform economy, platform businesses. These are companies, if you think about Uber, Amazon, these are companies that become part of our everyday lives. People, have them on their phone, they use them every day. These companies are really, really effective when it comes to mobilizing consumers to get what they want. So they mobilize consumer support for their particular business model, even though their employment model leaves much to be desired. And we can say the same kind of thing about low-cost airlines. So this is one of the founders of what is now the largest long-distance bus and coach service in Europe. This company was founded in Germany in 2013 when the German government deregulated the domestic bus market. Previously, they'd restricted this market to protect national railways. They opened the market up. All these new companies kind of came into the market, and the competitive process resulted in one company, Flixbus, now dominating the market, not just in Germany, but across Europe and now operating in America. What do? I mean, he looks just like Dennis Mitchell, don't you think? And he's got his little toy bus. We do everything that goes with the product. We do the network planning, we do the bus branding, all the marketing, communications, everything that goes with it, sales, IT, ticketing. But we don't own any buses and we don't employ any bus drivers. So it's a bit like a kind of Uber type model. Now you can guess, this is what we would call a kind of a lean platform business model. You can guess what the working conditions are like for some of these drivers. The European Union recently proposed a new mobility package with all these changes to improve mobility, some of which involve changes to drivers' driving and rest times, which we have regulations on, which would have particularly detrimental effects, especially for these drivers in these kind of contractor companies that are doing business for Flixbus. So we have to do a kind of a rapid data collection. We do a survey. There's a whole literature on this, on statistical activism, how you get data together to find those kind of key statistics, those telling statistics that you find. We actually again got we got a meeting in the European Parliament because we needed MEPs to vote against this. And what you do is you combine the statistics. So I go along with the PowerPoint presentation with all the data to show all these things. That's the logos, isn't it? The kind of scientific stuff. And then we get a truck. This guy was actually a truck driver from Poland. And he said to the MEPs, under the European Convention of Human Rights, what's the minimum cell size for a prisoner in Europe? So they're all scratching their heads. Nobody knew. I can't remember the numbers. It was like 6 meters or 6 square meters or something. What's the size of the truck that I live in, sleep in, work in for 3 months at a time? Because he works for a Dutch trucking company that is registered in Slovenia. He's from Poland and he drives a truck for 3 months. He can't afford to stop in registered truck stops and sleep in a bed, so he sleeps in his truck, and that's just 2 meters. So he's a prisoner in this thing for 3 meters. One of the reasons why you get the MEPs to do this is that these guys, because they can't afford to park in secure parking areas, they just park at the side of the road in laybys, and then they leave things behind in bottles, which local people don't like. So you can mobilise MEPs over these local issues and take it to a European level. So here's a rather different looking menace. This is the boss of Ryanair, Michael O'Leary. Now again, Ryanair, it's an Irish company. It is the largest airline in Europe. So again, when we talk about opening markets and creating competition, what do we do when you think about the local knowledge from particular sectors? What we get is monopoly, effectively, or dominant players in the market. So this is Ryanair's employment model. So they hire pilots as self-employed pilots. The majority of pilots who work for this company are technically self-employed. They used to be employed as individuals through an agency, but one of the criteria for being self-employed is that you can provide a substitute if you can't do the work. So what they do now is they make them set up these small companies through Irish accountants. So they recommend these Irish accountants to set them up. So you would have a group of 3, 4, 5 pilots maybe. So I might be told that I've got a company called Bristol Aviation, and there are 2 or 3 other members, but one might be from Poland, one might be from Spain, never met these people. It's just a fiction to get around the law of self-employment. I mean, the kind of things that you have for a self-employed person, you provide your own insurance. I mean, a 20-year-old pilot is not going to phone up the local insurance company and say, can I insure a Boeing 737 with 180 people in the back? I think it would be rather expensive. So if you actually look at the contracts, these people are clearly not self-employed. So we first had after doing the social payments, we then had to go at the employment model. We did a big survey of pilots across Europe and did 10 country case studies. So I did the UK, and EasyJet, and Ireland, and Ryanair. We had a big meeting in Paris with lots of other airlines, the other ones who want protection against the menace, and people from the European Commission. And the people from the European Commission were talking about this as a new business model. No, it's not a new business model. It's an illegal form of employment. That's what it is. Call it what it is. It's not. It's not. So it took us, 3 or 4 years. But in 2019, I did a report for the European Platform on Undeclared Work on bogus self-employment in aviation. We called it what it is, and this is a guidance manual for labour inspectors in different countries to identify, to try and identify and stamp out these policies. So you can kind of take. And there's lots of aspects of Ryanair's contract that and these kind of contracts that they have with the pilots that we challenge through the courts. But at some point, you've got to try and, change the way we think about these things and talk about these things. And this is about the way in which we regulate markets and think about markets. And the whole thing about deregulation and the neoliberal agenda, it's a shift from structural regulation to conduct regulation. So when we regulate the structure of the market, we say who can compete in the market on what terms. So, markets are created by entrepreneurs, but they're defined by governments, they're ordered by institutions, and they're governed by rules and regulations at some point. You just think about what's happening with Meta and these online businesses. We're actually starting to find that they do things that we didn't really like, and so we want to kind of regulate their activities. when you move from structure to conduct regulation, you open up the market and then you try to regulate people's behaviour post hoc. And it's actually quite difficult to define, anti-competitive behaviour. So one of the things that Ryanair did is they put on flights to a place called Frankfurt-Hahn. Hahn is 70 kilometres away from Frankfurt. We've got lots of airports in Europe, regional airports, ex-military bases. At first, nobody bothers about this, but eventually it becomes quite a big route. Local authorities invest in the airport. Ryanair goes along and says, we can put 1 million passengers through here, but we need transport connections, we need a better terminal. Is this state aid because Ryanair is the only user? Is this government funding for beneficial use of one private company? Because nobody else wants to fly there. So eventually, Lufthansa take a case against them to say, you can't call it Frankfurt-Hahn, you've got to say it's Hahn, so people know where they're going and where they've got to get to. And there are then things like advertising. So this is an example from Ryanair's annual charity calendar. So here's our boss again. These are all Ryanair cabin crew. Ryanair was, again, fell foul of the Advertising Standards Agency. But by then, you've already had the advert in the paper. You've already told people that you can go anywhere for 10 euros. 10 euros, for heaven's sakes, around Europe. This is one way of trying to stop the menace. You throw a custard pie in his face. This is Michael O'Leary heading to the European Commission to deliver a petition signed by 1.5 million passengers about trying to restrict the right of air traffic controllers to strike because it impacts on his business. The eco thing is really important actually because Ryanair's average flight cost fare last year was 37 euros. I mean, everybody wants to fly for 37 euros, and just think about the pollution and everything else that causes. So let me conclude by reading a quote. This is from a recent book by John Cruddas MP. John is the Labour MP, has been since 2001 in Dagenham and Rainham. John was one of our former PhD students at the University of Warwick. So John says that progressive politics are solace in liberal abstraction, appearing remote and disconnected from the people it seeks to represent. We can account for this crisis historically as representing the long-term victory of economistic and technocratic thinking. Ethical traditions have lost out to utilitarian approaches to justice. Consequently, the left has lost its language. The left has lost its language and existence in the everyday lives of the people. So the task is one of political reimagination. As industrial relations academics, our theoretical interventions also function as forms of political practice. We have lots of policy ideas. Often we can cohere these into a policy programme that address more than an immediate problem. But we also need to change the discourse, the way we talk about things, the way we talk about business models, independent contractors or independent contractors, self-employment, the gig economy. We need to talk about these things in a different way and call them out. This is what happened to me after I talked about Ryanair's policy in the European Parliament. I got a letter from Ryanair's lawyers saying that if I defame the company, they will take action against me. I didn't actually mention Ryanair in the Parliament in the speech, but everybody knew who you're kind of talking about. These companies are bullies, basically. They are a menace, and we need to do something about them. Oh, sorry, I need to go back one. Sorry, I've probably talked for too long, but time for questions. If you're wondering about all these little images that have been shown, these are all images from the Taylor Report on good work. Have you noticed anybody doing any work? Have you noticed any cooks or cleaners? Anybody with a toolbox? Have you noticed any women? Or how many women have you noticed compared to men? Have you seen anybody of colour? Any ethnic minorities? This apparently is what good work looks like in the 21st century. We're all skipping around. This is good work.
Okay, can we please thank Peter for his lecture? Thank you, Peter. So we have some time for questions. I can see a very eager person up the back, and then we'll come down here. Can I ask you to identify yourself before asking your question?
Bill West here, and I was just wondering if you looking from an industrial point, you sort of got to suck it up. The only party that's going to bring in those industrial relations laws that you want is a Labor Party. And they're going to play small target. They've learnt that from Australia. They've learnt it from America. And you just got to suck it up and wait until they get in and then hold their feet to the fire.
Yeah, I mean, there is that side of it in that kind of, and that's clearly what the Labour Party are doing at the moment. They're trying to minimise that so that they don't upset people, and because they've got a very big lead in the poll. The problem we have is, are they actually, when they get in, do they have an agenda? Have they thought these things through? I mean, we saw with Tony Blair that it kind of ran out of steam pretty quickly, got sidetracked by wars and various other things. But initially, we had a national minimum wage, we had a new Employment Relations Act, we signed up to the European Social Agenda. So we had a new treaty in 1997, the Treaty of Lisbon, and nearly all the improvements in employment law since then came through the European Union, which is one reason why the Brexiteers didn't like it.
Okay, over here, thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I'm glad you mentioned race to the bottom. And sorry, thank you. Eric Platt, a commerce graduate in Melbourne from some time ago. You mentioned race to the bottom, excellent, and a few other things. Have you studied Swiss railways? We get being told they run on time, and there must be a great model out there for the IR side of things and the HR side of things.
Railways is probably the only transport sector I don't do, unfortunately. But we have we've got a real problem with our railways at the moment. We've got ongoing strikes in the railways. We have this ridiculous model of separating the track from the operators. Different operating companies in Wales and Scotland have been brought back into public ownership. The rails that run across the north of England, Liverpool, Manchester, Leeds, Hull, I mean, those services just cannot run on time at all. So we've got a real problem with railways. I can never understand when, if you privatise something, why don't you let the people who know how to run and manage it? Why do you give it to the managers who apparently are failing previously? Why do you let them run them and make lots of money? But that's another policy idea that doesn't fly.
Greg.
Thanks, Peter. And Peter, I'm Greg Bamber at Monash University, and it was a brilliant Foenander Lecture, Pete. Good on you. And a comment and a question. Very short comment. You quoted John Cruddas' book there. John Cruddas told me, when I met him at your university a few months ago, that the British Labour Party and this small and moving target is very much learning from the Australian Labour Party and their strategy of winning the election last year. So that's just a comment. My question, briefly, is to what extent did the COVID pandemic help to herald the end of neoliberalism as various governments intervened in markets for labour and other things? This was in spite of their neoliberal rhetoric in many cases. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I just think a lot of that was a kind of fairly temporary thing for a lot of them. In the situation that they were in. We've got a really interesting public inquiry going on at the moment in the UK, where all the WhatsApp messages from ministers and the senior medical, scientific advisors are being shared at this public inquiry, and people said that when Boris Johnson was in power, basically it was Dominic Cummings that was running his kind of aide, who was the brains behind the Brexit campaign, was running the show. There's now comments that between senior civil servants saying we all thought Dom Cummings was running the government. It's actually Boris Johnson's wife who's running things. I think post-COVID has created a lot of problems. I think it's shown people that governments can intervene in these things, but it's kind of gone back very quickly to where they were before. I mean, if you just think about what Liz Truss and some of the other people are doing and the direction that the current government are being. One of the questions to you, I suppose, would be whether you think Labour's strategy in Australia has actually worked. You know, keep quiet and then do something interesting when you get in power. And is that something we can learn from kind of going forward?
Well, we're not going to get a collective response, not from this rabble, but you would say it's been proved very difficult for them, sort of having got into government, to prosecute their full agenda as a consequence, I think, of that small target. We've got the next question up there. We've got a question here. We'll come over here and work it from there. Thank you.
Mark Cernzak, Senior Social Justice Advocate for the Uniting Church in Australia. Just a question about what would you say was the best model you've seen to try and regulate the on-demand gig economy and actually create fairness for those who get caught in working for it?
Tough questions, Peter.
Yeah, well, in Europe we have an organisation, and I forgot the name of it now, but it's like one of those original kind of you know, like some of the very early unions when there wasn't any kind of social protection, and people sign up to that, and then they've got opportunities for unemployment insurance and various other forms of insurance through the kind of, you know, through that network. Sorry, I'm going to blame jet lag now, but I can't remember the author. There's been quite a bit written about this in Europe around kind of self-organising groups of people in the gig economy through I can't remember the name of the organisation, but it tries to act as an intermediary between these employers and the contractors to provide basically things like unemployment insurance and sick benefits and things like that when they can't work. Yeah, like a cooperative kind of thing, but does more around kind of individual services and insurance for people, and then tries also to stop you know, some of the practices where people get a bad rating and then lose work and things like that, to try and regulate some of those activities among some of these ride hire and these other companies.
We're running out of time, so a quick question.
Peter,
here.
hi, Philip Durham. I'm just wondering, listening to your description of neoliberal philosophy, whether in fact what it is just a cover story for maintaining class hegemony so that the wealthy upper classes maintain their power position and basically keep the middle and lower classes in subservience.
I mean, I wouldn't. I'm not going to disagree really with that. I mean, I think one of the problems for me with Jeremy Corbyn as leader, although we had, you know, greater reception in terms of some of the ideas that as IR academics that we had, Corbyn and that kind of phase of the Labour Party was kind of quite insular in many ways, and blamed elites for these things rather than talk about it in class terms. And while there is an issue around elites, and it's a very, again, that communicates well with people, but it's not that's not the root cause of the problem. And if you look across Europe at the moment, you know, we've got a cost of living crisis, but if you look at the data, it's also a profiteering crisis as well. And so when you know, this is not just, you know, elites. There's something structural going on within society, and so again, I don't think we should lose that kind of language and the way we talk about these things.
Great, thanks. Over here, thank you.
Hi there, my name's Amelia. I'm a journalist for the ABC, which is, I guess, our equivalent of the BBC, and report on industrial relations sometimes. I recently did a story on Qantas, the airline here, I'm sure you're all across, and they lost a High Court decision about the outsourcing of their baggage handlers, and they're likely to pay a fine, but actually economically it turned out better off for them to have outsourced in the first place. Wanted to know if you're across that story, what can be done to help workers of airlines, and if this is not just Australia or if it's other places as well.
Well, I mean, there's a really interesting, if you think about the kind of long-term, you know, the big picture of the 20th, over the last century, you know, we can think about the big integrated firms where there was, you know, long-term investment in, you know, the old kind of Fordist type companies where there was mutual benefits for all the different stakeholders, including labour. And that whole period was one of wage-led growth. By the time you get to the 1980s and you see these networks of contracts developing between firms. So airlines were a really good example of subcontracting out lots of work and doing that in different ways. So there were some airlines that created kind of global subsidiaries, and Lufthansa was a good example of that. Then you get other airlines like British Airways that have gone more for the kind of virtual airline thing, subcontract as much out as you possibly can. And instead of it being about managing your staff and your business, it's about managing these contracts that you have with suppliers. So I think in that particular context, I mean, that's an example of in your kind of home base where you operate, airlines often do things very, very differently, just historically for those kind of reasons. I mean, I followed that debate. I mean, whether it's one that's replicated elsewhere, you would find that most of the, if you like, the old national legacy airlines, the flag airlines, will still have a lot of those services in-house, but any other places they operate, they try and subcontract out as much as possible.
Thanks. I think this is going to be our last question. You had a question, sir? Yeah. There's a microphone coming.
Ken McAlpine from the National Tertiary Education Union. I was just wondering about the small target thing and the extent to which unions themselves have bought into neoliberal rhetoric as a basis for their justification, and whether the wave of strikes recently has changed that a bit in the UK.
Well, I think there's been some really interesting things about the disputes in the UK. One is new union leaders. So, for example, in the nurses' union, Pat McCullum becomes elected general secretary. She was the first person to lead a strike by the nurses in the UK. Mick Lynch in the railway unions has just been fantastic on the news. I mean, he's wiped the floor completely with journalists and unions. They've obviously the relationship with the Labour Party has changed, and a lot of them feel more confident about, demanding what is, what should be, a programme for Labour reform, and so in some respects, the fact that they're not as closely aligned or as have, their influence has been changed through voting rules and various other things in the party. Some of them are more confident about, about doing these things. I mean, one of the interesting ones recently was, Rachel Reeves was going to talk, one of our shadow ministers was going to talk at the TUC. And the way this was reported in the BBC was about social housing and things. And the BBC said some of the unions will be, wanting to see more on workers' rights. And they said they want a more radical approach to workers' rights. We're talking about actually meeting international standards in relation to strike action and things. And so it's described as a radical, it's not radical at all, it's just international standards. So the whole way in which these things are kind of talked about at all kinds of different levels, I think is really important. And a lot of unions are giving them a hard time.
Well, I'm afraid we have no more time for questions. I want to thank you all for coming along. Peter, a fantastic sort of lecture, plenty to think about. Can we please thank Peter in the usual way? And a small gift as a token of our appreciation. Thank you, Peter.
Thanks very much.
Have a good evening, people. Thank you for coming along.